Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me in the room?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, excellent. Well, we're here for the Prebbleton rezoning hearings. I'm Lindsay Daish. I'm one of the commissioners who's been considering the proposed district plan. In the hearing room, we have Commissioner Solomon, and online with me we have Commissioner Reid, also Councillor Reid. I presume you've caught up with the issue with Commissioner Van Voorsthausen, who was due to be chairing these formal proceedings. He's in Hawke's Bay and has been unable to connect to these hearings for obvious reasons. So what we've decided to do is I'll chair the formal part of the hearing. Commissioner Van Voorsthausen, when he is able to, will look at the proceedings online, and if he has any additional questions over and above any we may ask, he'll put those formally in writing. Unfortunately, it's just the nature of the beast with the cyclone that we have to make these adjustments. I'd certainly like to be there in person as well, but being based in Wellington on Tuesday, things were pretty dodgy here as well. So if we can proceed. Before I ask the first submitter to proceed, is there anything additional from the Section 42A team?
No, thank you.
Okay. First submission is the Daly Family Trust. Ms. Everly. Good morning.
Good morning.
You've appeared before us before. We've obviously read the legal submissions and the evidence which has been presented, but you're more than welcome to run the case as you see fit, with general introductions and highlight the key points which you wish to make. I believe you've got a number of submitters, people giving evidence as well. So if I perhaps hand it over to you and you can take us forward from here.
Thank you, tēnā koutou katoa. This is the submission for Daly Family Trust in McIlwraith. It relates to the land on the corner of Shands and Blake's Road. Distinguishing it from the majority of other submissions, this submission seeks rezoning to large lot residential. The case for rezoning is that it's necessary to provide sufficient housing supply in the short, medium and long term, particularly having regard to the large lot residential market and the Prebbleton location. The land's currently held in multiple fragmented and undersized lots, which is not economic for primary production, and that the site is suitably located in proximity to Prebbleton, and that the large lot residential zoning would support the urban form of Prebbleton. I've addressed the statutory framework in my submissions, just to cover a couple of key points there in relation to the MPS HPL. My primary submission is that the site does not fall within the interim definition, given the operative district plan zoning, and accordingly that the MPS doesn't apply. Alternatively, and I understand that you've requested a legal submission on that point, if you consider that the NPF does apply, evidence for the submitter establishes that the site satisfies clause 3.6 for rezoning from rural to urban. In relation to the NPS-UD, the rezoning achieves the policy direction in relation to making responsive planning decisions that provide sufficient housing capacity and a well-functioning urban environment. Noting that direction around well-functioning urban environment includes to supply of housing choice. Finally, in terms of the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement, the rezoning doesn't give effect to those provisions relating to development in accordance with MAP-A and rural residential development in accordance with rural residential strategies. However, in my submission, where there's insufficient housing capacity, those provisions of the regional policy statement that prescribe fixed development locations do not accord with the MPSUD direction for responsive decision making to provide sufficient housing capacity in a well-functioning urban environment. The rezoning otherwise gives effect to the RPS provisions. In my assessment, the key issues for you relate to the location and urban form, and that is addressed by Ms. Lowenstein, and she will address you on that further shortly. Whether there should be large lot residential development at the density proposed, which is different from the rural residential density prescribed by the RPS, and it is at a greater density than the standard large lot residential provisions as notified. Our evidence addresses that provides a more efficient use of land, provides greater housing supply, and better meets the market demand. And finally, whether this rezoning should occur now. I understand there's been some discussion through other hearings about deferral to spatial planning processes. The evidence establishes that there is short and medium term demand for the capacity that would be provided by this rezoning. And in my submission, the spatial planning process is unlikely to deliver any further zoned land to market for in the range of 7 to 10 years. The witnesses that I have with me today, Mr. McIlwraith, who is one of the submitting landowners, Mr. Ford, who provides evidence on primary production economics, he's available by Zoom. Mr. Colgrave, addressing economics, he's also available by Zoom. Mr. Gallett on transport, Ms. Lowenstein on urban design, and Ms. Aston on planning. I propose that Mr. Colgrave provide you with a brief verbal summary. Ms. Lowenstein and Ms. Aston have prepared short summary statements to present today, and we intend that the remainder of the witnesses will go straight to any questions that you have for them. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm obviously sitting in Wellington at the moment. The summary statements, Ms. Aston in particular, are they the same as the executive summaries in her evidence, or is it a nuanced version? And if so, is it possible that I could get a copy electronically?
Yes, they are a nuanced version incorporating key issues from both the evidence in chief and rebuttal statements. I will endeavour to get those to you electronically.
Yeah, that's fine. It's a little bit of a hybrid hearing, this, as you'll appreciate, so we'll just box on. But it would be useful if certainly if there is new or nuanced material being presented in the summary statement, that we could have that in front of us, as ideally. So yeah, we will see how we get on. Before you go to your witnesses, I'll just see if there's any questions on the legal submissions from Raywin, you first. Nicole? Okay. I don't have any particular questions on the legal submissions. We're hearing quite a lot of similar themes in terms of MPSUD and also the MPS HPL through the hearings that we had in Rolleston a couple of weeks ago, or for Rolleston a couple of weeks ago. And I gather that's a similar theme which is coming through in the other hearings which are to come. You're correct in that Commissioner Van Voorsthuyzen, or the chair, has requested a legal submission on the MPS HPL in particular, and the applicability of that. We don't have that as yet, and I'm unsure whether or not, because I haven't been able to speak to Commissioner Van Voorsthuysen, who is doing all the hearings, as to whether or not we will be seeking parties' views on that, whether it's a to and a fro and a to and a fro, because or not. But we'll make that clearer in due course when we have the ability to discuss that between the hearing panel.
Thank you.
But,
I'm appearing in later rezoning hearings, so it might be something that I can pick up at that point.
Yes, no, I appreciate that. This is, I think, the second of the rezoning hearings of 9, which will be progressing reasonably rapidly over the next few weeks. But I don't have any particular legal issues. As I said before, we've had a number of submissions and a number of pieces of planning evidence in relation to the MPSUD, and also in relation to the MPS-HPL as well. So I think your position is clear. Thank you.
Thank you. In that case, Mr. McIlwraith is here. Should you have any questions for him?
I'll just ask the other commissioners. I personally don't. It's a fairly short statement of evidence, and it's from the landowner's perspective. Rowan, Nicole?
No, I don't have any questions. I found your evidence quite clear and it didn't bring any questions to my mind. Thank you.
I don't have any questions either.
So unless Mr. McIlwraith wants to highlight any particular points?
No, not at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you.
In that case, the next witness is Mr. Ford, who I'm hoping is sitting somewhere in the Zoom room. Mr. Ford, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Great, thank you. We can hear you, but we can't see you. I'm not sure whether you're able to activate your camera.
How's that?
Great, thank you. I propose that Mr. Ford also go straight to any questions that you have for him.
Yes, certainly. It's very,
yes, I can.
Yeah, it's certainly very interesting evidence. But perhaps we'll go to Rowan first. Have you got any particular questions of Mr. Ford?
No questions from me. Thank you.
Nicole?
No questions from me either. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. You've provided a fairly a comprehensive statement of evidence in relation to what you say. There's a couple of things I'm interested in. First is the whole land use categorization confidence levels that we have at the moment, whether or not the land in question is likely to be mapped in the future as highly productive land. Well, what's your view on the whole process that the regional council and then the district?
Sorry, can I interrupt?
Yes, certainly, if it's helpful.
There seems to be a loop going on that's repeating your questions. So, can you hear that?
I can hear you okay.
Okay.
But
I can hear a loop of your previous discussion.
Unsure what we can do with the technology to assist. Heather, is there anything we can do?
Excuse me, we're just checking whether Mr. Ford has his live streaming going at the same time.
Oh, yes, I do.
You could turn that off.
Sorry. Sorry. Sorry, Mr. Dace, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, it's just really around the land use classifications, which are obviously the foundations of what is allocated as highly productive land and the process to be gone through in the future in terms of formalising that at the regional council level and then through the district plans as well. Whether you've got any views about whether or not there may be some changes, or the confidence that you have in the current classifications which have been provided for the land in question?
I've found in other instances where similar sized blocks of land have had a more accurate assessment of the land use classes. And so some of them change quite a bit from what's in the 1 to 50,000 maps as we've got it. But if you have a look in this case, the land use map and the soil map match each other pretty well. So I'm pretty confident that in this case it's a reasonable representation of it. I think that it probably would change with a more nuanced look at it, but probably not enough to change any of my recommendations or findings.
Thank you. My second question is in relation to your experience with reverse sensitivity from, say, agricultural activities being in place and then a more sensitive activity going in proximity to that. Is your statements about reverse sensitivity, they're based on your experience in the field that you work in, I presume?
Yeah, yes, it is. I've had a lot of experience with a similar thing of reverse sensitivity, particularly up around Auckland, around the vegetable production areas around there, and there's a huge conflict between urban development and rural use up there, and also in Canterbury as our smaller towns have expanded. There's been reverse sensitivity onto the farming activities that are caused in the neighbourhood, and it's my opinion that with a reasonable amount of discussion and negotiation between the parties, that a reasonable solution should be able to work out to reverse sensitivity. But in my experience, urban people are pretty set in their opinions, and it's very hard to negotiate a satisfactory conclusion to those.
So what does that apply to small lots of land which are being used for primary production, or is it the more extensive areas of land like around Pukekohe, for example, where there's a lot of market gardening activity and housing encroaching towards that? Does the same statement apply to very small blocks or smaller blocks, say 4 hectares?
Yes, they do, because usually if there's productive land on those smaller blocks of land, it's very intensive to make it pay. So the sensitivity goes up quite considerably by the neighbours.
By intensive you mean things like strawberry growing or things which get a high rate of return per hectare for the rural land as opposed to pastoral activities.
Yeah. Highly intensive horticultural opportunities like berry growing and things like that, which have with them all the sorts of activities which create reverse sensitivity, like spraying, working tractors at night, and things like that.
Okay, and looking at the particular site we've got here, or the sites we've got here, it's your conclusions are because of the land fragmentation, that economic use of those properties for agricultural, horticultural purposes is significantly diminished or pretty minor.
Yeah, well, it's more that it's not commercially viable to do that. Yeah.
I guess it's the question is not only whether it's commercially viable, it's whether or not it's a good thing to do in the first place.
Yeah. I personally think that in this case, the fact that the block of land is in 15 different titles already, which are all extensively developed for lifestyle, basically precludes any productive potential for them.
Okay, so in that immediate vicinity, beyond the site in question, would the same factors apply? Like
Yes.
we're being asked to look at a large lot residential zoning on currently rural land in between Prebbleton Township and the Southern Motorway. So in terms of other landowners in that immediate vicinity, is there limitations on those properties? I guess my question, the point of my question is if we get a large lot residential proposal such as this, is there going to be any additional pressure because other landowners are in the same position where they have a small lot? They say that they cannot use it for economic productive purposes, so therefore by subdividing down even further, there will be no opportunity in the future for productive land to be utilised. Do you understand my question?
Yeah, and it's my opinion that the productive potential of this land was lost when it was subdivided in the first place. Okay.
And in terms of your expertise, you're one of the inputs into future strategic planning process, and Council has outlined that that the position of the submitter is that the strategic planning process is about why and where growth should go into the future is too far on the horizon. So in terms of other similar circumstances that there might be around the country, do you see strategic planning happening first, or is it reactive to the proposals put forward by individual landowners?
Probably a better question to ask Mr. Colgrave, who's coming after me, but my opinion is that the demand is there now. So the strategic planning, should have been 5 years ago, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So my opinion is that the strategic planning is, in terms of meeting current demand, is late.
Okay. Okay, thanks. I'll put that question to Mr. Colgrave when he comes on. But I don't have any further questions. Thank you for your evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next witness is Mr. Colgrave. Good morning, Mr. Colgrave. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Great, thanks. There you are, great. I understand that you're going to give a brief verbal summary of your evidence and then go to questions. Thank you.
That's right. Yeah, thank you. As you'll be aware from this evidence and previous evidence I've provided, the district faces a very, very strong demand outlook, but has a critical lack of supply, particularly over the short to medium term. And that's something that we've found across all of the major townships, including Prebbleton. And within that, there's a really noticeable lack of the large lot residential options. And in my evidence, I show there's only 20 sort of large lots left that are vacant in Prebbleton. There's none others forecast to come through, and there's not much happening in that sort of size range now with the upzoning and NDRS applying to the residential areas. So critical need to have more large lot residential, and particularly in Prebbleton. And the other major finding from my evidence was that the economic costs and benefits of using the land for the proposed use far outweigh those of rural production. And there's several reasons for those, which I outline in my evidence. The key ones, I guess, are that the site is too small and the parcels are too small, the land's too valuable, and most of that sort of production tends to occur further away in much cheaper areas. So we need lots more large lot residential. The proposal is a much better use of the land from an economic perspective. So in my view, it meets the requirements of the NPS HPL and also makes a great contribution to the NPSUD. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Colgrave. I'll just see if there's any questions from Rowan, you first.
No, thank you.
None from me either, thank you.
Mr. Colgrave, you appeared in the Rolleston hearings a couple of weeks ago, which were obviously a different sort of rezoning. You're looking at a large lot proposal here.
Yes.
I put to Mr. Ford previously the whole issue of the importance in an economic sense of certainty in terms of strategic planning. We have the Canterbury RPS, which says what it says currently about rural residential zoning and the circumstances in which that would be considered, and that is based upon a strategic planning exercise at that time. In terms of the whole area in between Prebbleton itself and the southern motorway, do you feel if there was a proposal to rezone this land from an economic perspective that there would be pressure on the additional land outside of this large lot residential proposal but in the general vicinity? Could you basically, would you from an economic perspective not be able to rely on high level strategic documents to actually look at where growth should go?
Yeah, look, so really good question, sir. I'm certainly not saying that we should turn our back on the RPS. Obviously, that's a really critical guiding document. But I think the critical thing as well is that all of that work that went into the RPS is some time ago, and no one at that time foresaw the growth that has occurred in the district. So the planning that I think that took place for Waimak and Rolleston and Prebbleton and all those other places was based on a view at that point in time of how growth was going to play out. And what we've seen since then is growth that is literally off the charts. So I think we're in a future that wasn't really foreseen at that time. So while it's really important that we don't sort of deviate from planning structures en masse, at times like this, I think we need to be more flexible and responsive when things are different to what we had planned at that time. So, those planning documents are important, but there's such long timeframes associated with reviewing and updating those and implementing them. And at the same time, we have this sort of property market shortage. So it's a balancing act, I think, between having that broader strategic vision, but being flexible when things are change and when we get market signals that things need to be done.
So I guess what you're saying is that in terms of being responsive to unplanned urban development or unanticipated urban development under the NPSUD, that this particular site is right up there in terms of the contextual factors which apply to it.
Absolutely, sir. That's right. I mean, it's very close to the township. The way that it's fragmented now means that it really wouldn't be useful for rural production. So, if you've got a willing, and able and keen group that really want to bring this to market and it's in a location like this, then, at the margin, it makes more economic sense to use it for that purpose.
Yeah, and we did talk a little bit at the Rolleston hearings about short-term, medium-term, longer-term provision and so forth.
Yes.
So I understand from your evidence, you're saying under all three scenarios, short, medium, and longer term, there's an insufficiency of supply, not only of just general residential, but also in the large lot markets.
That's right, sir. I mean, I know you've heard this from me before, but just one example: the council's planning for 900 dwellings a year, including the competitiveness margin of 20%. We did 2,000 consents last year, and that's without any buffers or anything on top of it. So we're running at more than double that rate. It's an alarming prospect. Yeah, I mean, if you we won't keep that pace up forever, but if we continually outpace those projections by hundreds every year, then that cumulative shortfall is just astounding.
And that takes into account the correction that there has happened.
Well, the correction's really.
Well.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, sir.
No, that's right.
It's a bit hard on the videos format. The correction really has just been a drop in price. It hasn't really reflected in a drop in demand. So what we care about is how many people or how many dwellings we need to provide, not what the prices are associated with those. If anything, the price coming back will make it more attractive for some people. I think we were getting to the point where prices were rising to the point that if they'd kept going like that, they would have started to squeeze some demand out. But now that the price is coming back, from a consumer demand perspective, it's even more attractive. It might not be as attractive from a developer's perspective as it was 6-12 months ago, but certainly looking long term, it's still an attractive place to be developing.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Colgrave. I don't have any additional questions. I think we did traverse a number of these matters in the Rolleston hearing a couple of weeks ago. So,
sure.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next witness I have available is Mr. Gallett on transport matters. He has a summary statement at the beginning of his evidence, so I propose that he goes straight to any questions.
That's fine, thank you. I'll see if we've got any questions of Mr. Gallett. Rowan?
I'm not sure. So, Mr. Gallett, did you assess the traffic effects internal of the proposal? I just wondered what the effects would be external of the proposal. For instance, should 0488, the Delhi proposal, and 0417, the Fisher proposal, come to fruition, it's a significant length of Blake's Road that will be maybe exposed to a neighbourhood amenity as opposed to a rural amenity. Am I asking the right person the right question?
Oh, that's possibly a question for Ms. Lowenstein.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
okay.
Sorry, I'm just having problems hearing the witness. So.
Is that on there now?
It's only just started.
Perfect.
Sorry, can you give me that?
No.
Can we just?
How about now?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Technology. Sorry, that question is perhaps best put to Ms. Lowenstein.
Yeah, thank you. Did you hear that, Mr. Daish?
Yes, I did. Thank you. And Nicole?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I've only just got one, Mr. Gallett, which is in relation to we've currently got some lots which are looking to be further fragmented down into smaller lots here. So it very much turns from being a more rural context, even though it does have limitations in terms of size, to a much more urban context with potentially lots as small as 1,000 square meters, I understand, as being the minimum lot size. With that, do you feel that there is going to be a requirement for urban amenities in terms of curb and channels and footpaths and so forth, leading from the site across busy Shands Road to the remainder of Prebbleton?
I think, yeah, those pedestrian and cycle facilities and infrastructure would support development and could be developed on Blake's Road.
And I may have missed it, but is the proposal in a future outline development plan to provide that urban level of amenity?
There were, I believe,
in terms of a footpath at least, and then potentially things like curb and channel.
there were definitely
Possibility of
footpaths.
safe pedestrian crossings. Sorry, I'm cutting across you. We're having a little bit of feedback.
Yep, sorry about that. There were pedestrian connections indicated on the outline development plan within the sites and also along the Blake's Road frontage and out to the intersection where there are pedestrian and cycle crossing facilities. At the moment, Blake's Road east of Shands has a section down to Aberdeen that doesn't have any footpath connection. However, there's a wide shoulder that could accommodate cycling and pedestrian movement. And it's expected that would be developed with further development of the sites adjoining that bit of Blake's Road.
Do you know if the council or any developer has any proposal to more urbanise the existing roading environment?
I'm not aware of any
on
specific.
the other side of I keep on getting my Shands and my Blakes mixed up. On the other side of Shands Road?
I'm not aware of any specific proposals at this stage.
Okay, thank you. But in summary, you feel with the limitation on the number of crossing points to the road network, centralisation of those site distances, that sort of thing is all acceptable from a traffic engineering perspective if there was to be a large lot residential zoning on the properties.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next witness is Ms. Lowenstein. Hopefully you have now received by email her summary statement.
I have received via email Ms. Aston's summary statement. That's the only one I've got at the moment. Well, if I don't have it, Ms. Lowenstein, is your summary statement basically saying what you are in your rebuttal and in your evidence in chief, or is it more nuanced? Or
it's slightly more nuanced. I do not go into the power lines, which I've covered in the rebuttal, because I don't consider that a major concern. I'm just addressing urban growth and form, the suitability of the large lot residential, and also some points around choice of residential environments, Shands Road, and connectivity. But if you have questions specific on those, we could maybe even just do them as questions.
Well, why don't you read out your summary statement and we'll see what transpires out of that.
All right, I'll keep any introductions out of it. I just surmise that I'm not going into the electrical distribution line, And then in paragraph 3, reflecting on the section 42A report, this leaves the key points of a compact urban form, overall connectivity, and whether the large lot residential zoning is a good fit for the site within the urban context. And then on urban growth and form, although the key growth directions and patterns have not necessarily changed for Prebbleton since the release of the Prebbleton structure plan, which is 2010, this is a long time ago, and the rural residential strategy in 2014, there has been some progressive changes have occurred in respect of the site. And I then cut into, and it's a copy out of my evidence, just where I explain the changes that have occurred. So I maybe jump over that unless you would like me to read them out.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Good. So all these changes have resulted in an ongoing intensification and urban growth of the township. And this is set to continue considering the demand for housing and the attractive location of Prebbleton in such close proximity to Christchurch. I have then added in a graphic, which is in my main brief of evidence, which is figure 9, just to give an overview of what's currently actually happening around Prebbleton. Follow on with that there is only a small pocket to be completed on the opposite side of Shands Road, and that would require development to directly link the site with the current urban fabric. And the surrounding area around this pocket is already zoned residential, and it can be expected that this in the near future that pocket will develop as well. Ideally, and it is my opinion from an urban design perspective, it should be general residential zoned to provide a really effective use and density. And I am aware of submission. I'm just adding to my statement because I made some small mistakes in this paragraph 6, so I need to reissue that paragraph 6. But I am aware of submissions of this pocket of land under the proposed plan review here. So that just indicates the pressure on and demand for new residential areas to be opened up within and around Prebbleton. So the large lot residential suitability, and for the following reasons, the site is most suitable to be developed as a large lot residential site with average densities of 250 to 3,000 and down to a minimum lot size of 1,000 square meters. It is the area in question is a small and agriculturally unproductive land with small lifestyle blocks that are unlikely to return to a productive farming environment. And I think it has been confirmed from a prior witness, and it will allow this area between the motorway and the edge of the town to retain a semi-rural appearance and assists in creating a landscaped edge of the township. Just to clarify that, when I say a semi-rural appearance, it doesn't mean it is rurally zoned. It just means that there's sufficient space between the built forms coming through to still allow for a significant amount of landscaping and private gardens. And also the way this proposal has been put forward is it would retain landscaping edge towards Shands Road. So there wouldn't be driveways coming off Shands Road. So the appearance and streetscape along Shands Road would actually not alter apart from a better entry point into the development. So that's what I mean with keeping a semi-rural sort of appearance. It is already developed in this particular land is already developed in an atypical manner for a rural site with smaller than normal lot sizes. They are approximately 1.5 to 3.9 hectare. However, I would still consider it underdeveloped as it displays a large amount of leftover land between the existing dwellings, making this development form reasonably inefficient, in particular in this location. When I talk about leftover land, I mean it is land that is actually not used for the residential domestic curtilage around the houses. It's actually left as paddocks, literally. So it has a reasonably rural appearance, but no rural function at all. The 2,500 to 3,000 square meter average concept will provide a more efficient and less wasteful result, as this size corresponds to the average domestic curtilage for a rural residential lot. Although the site, although zoned rural, does not contribute to productive farming practices and with the inefficient use of the lifestyle blocks, and will remain under pressure to either allow urban growth from Prebbleton to gradually move across Shands Road or accommodate gradual encroachment of the motorway and associated industrial functions. On the matter of choice, large lot residential replaces to some extent the small rural residential lots that have been identified by the RRS, but have now resorted to full residential development on the outskirts of Prebbleton. This is in response to the need for residential intensification and the overarching directives given by the government. And I don't list all the particular documents here, but I think we're all well aware of them. And it's definitely also reflected in the Enabling Act. The large residential development will continue to provide a wider choice of housing options for the residents of Prebbleton, and that has been covered by Mr. Colgrave as well. With regards to Shands Road, I think it's really important because it has been mentioned that Shands Road is a boundary for urban development or a boundary of Prebbleton. Just want to reiterate that a road is a connecting feature rather than a separating element, unless it is designed as such, like a highway, which is not crossable. Roads are designed to service both sides of the road and are areas where urban expansion and growth occurs first. So if we look at urban growth patterns, it's along the roads, which are the connecting features, that growth occurs, and it's always on both sides of the road. I would therefore consider Shands Road to not be a strong boundary, but a transitional space lending connectivity to the site. I acknowledge the role of Shands Road as an important movement corridor to access the southern motorway, resulting in potentially increased traffic volumes and higher speeds. I also see Shands Road as a limit to the standard urban development densities like the GRZ zone and medium density areas. Shands Road provides high levels of connectivity from the site to Hornby and onwards to Christchurch, and is a main access way onto the southern motorway that connects the site to the wider traffic network. This type of road has an affinity with large lot residential zone as proposed, which is internally accessed and retains the existing landscape edge to the road corridor. So in my opinion, large lot residential is a very good fit to sit alongside the role and the type of Shands Road and the role that it plays within the wider sort of network. With regards to connectivity, the site features high connectivity to both Prebbleton and Christchurch, and I think I've covered that in my evidence significantly. Blake's Road maintains a direct connection from the site to Prebbleton Township and links to Springs Road, which also connects then to the local commercial, education and recreation and other amenities nearby. The road itself, that is Blake's Road, has undergone a process of urbanization from a rural road to a residential street, which I expect to continue. So close to the town centre and around the school, and where driveways come off Blake's Road onto individual properties, that urbanization provides curb and channel and footpaths and things like that. Further towards the site, it is still a road of a rural standard with large sort of wide grass strips to the side and no curb and channel. A shared pedestrian cycle path along Blake's Road would be able to safely connect the development with the existing urban areas of Prebbleton. A priority crossing on Shands Road can be provided to connect directly on into the site if that was required. So that is really my summary of the key urban design aspects that may still need discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Lowenstein. We'll see if we've got questions. Rowan?
Yes. In your paragraph 9, you talk about an atypical manner. What do you mean by atypical?
Atypical for normally for hectare rural dwelling, which has a far more I wouldn't say wasteland, but the opportunities for smaller horticultural functions, for some farm animals to be kept. But this is not the case in this particular one. The lots are not utilized in that at all in that sense.
Okay. And you might have heard my question to Mr. Ford earlier, or was it Mr. Colgrave, one of them, about Blake's Road. So should 0488, the Delhi proposal, be accepted for rezoning, and 0417, the Fisher proposal, be accepted for rezoning, that will mean a significant length of Blake's Road will be reduced from the rural amenity Is that right? Am I understanding this right?
It's quite a matter of detail. So I will attempt to explain how I would consider that. The change from a rural road to a residential or urban road with curb and channel and a different amenity really depends on how many access ways it has, how many properties it services, how much traffic is generated and runs through it, how many intersections are there. So that's not all my expertise. That's where I rely on a traffic engineer. But in general, in my experience, is that large lot residential areas that are developed to be internally accessed. So there are no driveways lined up like in a normal urban environment. In that situation, the rural amenity and nature of a road can be maintained to a large extent. However, there may need to be some introduction of curb and channels at entryways. But
I was thinking more about speed limits, reducing the need to reduce speed limits because of increased residential activity. And I'm mindful that the council don't want to slow working traffic down and keep, so that's where I'm angling, or what I'm that
is probably outside of my area of expertise when it comes to actual traveling speeds and speed limits.
Okay, good. And then this proposal has a roundabout in it, doesn't it?
Within the site?
I think it's on Shands Road.
That roundabout already exists.
Okay. That's all the questions from me. Thank you.
Nicole?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
I've got a few things. Firstly, if you look at a map of Prebbleton, the urban area of Prebbleton, and then you look at the district plan map, both the operative district plan and then the proposed district plan, and then with the variation 1 plan
I do not have these maps in front of me straight away.
So, but you're familiar with the area.
Yes.
In terms of what is anticipated for residential development, be it large lot or otherwise, one of the things in the certainly alluded to in the NPSUD is and certainly in the urban growth policies of Selwyn District Council, is the whole issue of a compact urban form. Now, Shands Road, when you look at the map, does appear to be, if you like, a northwestern limit to Prebbleton in terms of the existing zoning with the rural zoning. This proposal looks at a finger of land which goes on the other side of Shands Road and projects towards the motorway. How does that add to Prebbleton having a compact urban form?
Just to start, a compact urban form is not necessarily always a central point and then a circle around it. I think it's really important to look into how from the various areas you can actually access the township. And that is where Blake's Road is a reasonably short connection in the big picture for Prebbleton, and connects the site back into the township. The nature of the proposal being large residential, although a residential zone, is far more of a self-contained environment, particularly if it hasn't got access points to each a lot from the outside. But more importantly, when it comes to Prebbleton, the development pattern of Prebbleton has many constraints that are in some ways not necessarily interfering with creating the most suitable compact shape, which would be a concentric, in the center and a circle around it, because of the motorway, because of power lines, because of the that are around the north and the east and sort of swinging around that area. Also, the boundary between Selborne and then the Christchurch, the actual governance of that is quite close to the north. So you can see how the growth to the north has actually been impaired quite over time because of those constraints. And now with the Southern Motorway, there is an area that sits between Shands Road and the motorway, which will in the long run be a leftover piece of land. And for that reason, it is actually really suitable to connect it back into Prebbleton. And when I do urban analyses like this, and we look at compact urban form, we need to actually take all of these constraints and options and strengths and weaknesses in terms of how we connect into the equation. And the site sits on the edges in sort of a slightly on the perimeter of what is considered, probably what I could consider the more compact part of Prebbleton. However, the nature of large residential, that is where these should be located. They shouldn't be located within. So I would be, I think, this, from an urban designer point perspective, having large residential in closer proximity to the township takes away the ability for a township to actually grow into a compact form. So that is the critical point here. If we put large residential within that area, we are actually creating islands of disconnection because they are not as permeable as general residential zones and medium density zones. So it's really important to look at the bigger picture of Prebbleton and where these LLR zones can be located best. And this is a real strong candidate for it, because it would not take away from potentially the highly productive areas, although that's not my expertise. I rely on others to inform me on that, and it can be connected well into the township.
Okay, and in terms of my original point about Shands Road and this being, if you like, a finger going towards the motorway here, you're saying that that's acceptable from an urban form perspective to have something like that?
It depends. You need to look at it from a time perspective. As an example, Hallsville once was a village and is now a suburb of Christchurch. So it really becomes an issue of what time structures we put in place. This area between Shands Road and the motorway over a longer term will develop because it is easy to develop. It is close to major connecting roads. So there's a logic in that. Development doesn't just happen because someone does a plan change. There are demand and there's also suitability of the land and availability of the land. This area between Shands Road and the motorway is a pocket that will fill in with development over time. There's no question about it. I have not seen areas like this remain rural at this size. The only way that they can be, if we talk about protected from any kind of development, would be to designate them into a massive park or something like that and give them a use that is actually desired and useful for the area. So yeah. That's really how I see this development sitting within that area.
Yeah, there's a little bit there in your answer. I'm reasonably familiar with Hallswell, but Hallswell was the expansion of that was based upon a strategic planning exercise, and I think the Southwest Area Plan from recollection.
Yep.
Been a while since I looked at it, so it was a planned expansion that Christchurch would needed to grow, and Hallswell was a village, and it was identified early on that would be an area for expansion. Now, in terms of Prebbleton, obviously the strategic planning exercises which have been done are a little bit dated, I understand. Mm-hmm. But wouldn't a proposal such as this have a whole lot more confidence in the whole planning regime if there was a strategic planning exercise which identified the area in between Prebbleton and the motorway to go to more intensive land uses, as opposed to a situation we have here where we've got a multiplicity of zones, certainly with variation 1 as well, and we've got Shands Road being quite a strong barrier in between the growth of Prebbleton as we now know it, and land to the northwest?
In an ideal world, we would have strategic plans at various scales, and I think it's an important part that the Northwest Area Plan had a large area, larger than the area that we're talking about here, really. Strategic plans are at a large scale connecting, but they also then should provide some information at smaller scale for specific areas. And I think that is where things sort of fall through the cracks. This particular area is literally too small to actually be covered with an area plan or with a large strategic plan. And that is where a combination of the process we're undertaking right now, the district plan review, individual private plan changes, and then the government directives and guidance being given, that is also part of strategic planning. So not every area requires a very detailed strategic exercise. For this area, I can quite confidently say that if we were to do a strategic exercise for that particular small area, which is sort of not really what is done in that scale, it would probably result in the same understanding that this sits between a motorway, that it isn't an area for a large regional park, yeah, I'm quite comfortable with the information being gathered through plan change applications to provide sufficient information to actually make these decisions.
Now, how do you know that? How do you get that level of confidence?
Because I've analyzed
this area to the northwest of Prebbleton will be looked at in the future to subdivide down to smaller lot sizes than there are at the moment. Isn't that a council community-led response to growth, as opposed to an individual series of landowners wanting to do something?
I think this is probably also straying a little bit into the planning side, which I'm not a planner, so I just need to.
You've said a number of things about, you know, confidence in this area being potentially, you know, looked at in the future for further intensification, and that's from an urban design perspective, which looks at the various different components of growth and where it should go from a micro scale through to a more macro scale.
Yeah, this is from a analysis of urban patterns and urban growth patterns within the area and around Prebbleton. So this is as an urban designer, in some ways you analyze how things have grown in the past, and then you make informed sort of decisions, or there are some assumptions in there. There always are when you look forward with forward planning as to how this growth would continue, considering the existing underlying structure that is there. So that is an urban analysis and looking into the growth patterns. The processes that underpin that from a planning point of view, in terms of whether that is then achieved through strategic planning from the council, or whether that is then achieved through plan changes, I think those are more planning mechanisms. I think it's important to separate that out. When I'm looking at the urban analyses, I really look at the existing growth patterns that will then continue to grow. So if that answers the question.
Well, yeah, sort of. I guess my reservation about some of that is that there has been you know, Prebbleton for its size, there's an awful lot been going on in and around Prebbleton in the last few years, and continuing as well. And the community should be have an expectation that it's policy led, and it's based on the view of achieving good outcomes. Now, this proposal has not been foreseen by the regional policy statement, because it's outside the area which has been identified for rural residential growth. It it goes across Shands Road, which is a busy arterial road, which has a connection function in between the motorway and Prebbleton and other areas in the general vicinity as well. And we being asked to look at something which is different from what is being anticipated by the existing planning framework.
I think I think Mr. Colgrave summed that up quite succinctly. What was anticipated in terms of growth and what has occurred, they diverge quite significantly. What the RPS, the framework it put up, was not anticipating this amount of growth. And when I then look at what actually happened on the ground, the fact that we have a roundabout at the Shands Blakes intersection indicates that the roundabout has equal entry and exit points to actually work. So those are indicators for me showing that the growth pattern that is existing is actually continuing, and that the RPS to some extent the limits that it sets in terms of as to how far we grow are not actually accurate anymore when we look at the reality on the ground.
Okay. You mentioned the roundabout. My understanding that that roundabout was put in primarily for safety reasons as opposed to capacity reasons. And I'm sorry, it's probably possibly a question I should have asked the traffic witness.
Yeah, that's not my expertise, but if I look at a roundabout and roundabouts being introduced, they slow the speeds down significantly, and roundabouts, as far as I understand, require equal flows coming through to actually work succinctly, but I would prefer if Mr. Gallett would actually cover that. And
is Mr. Gallett still there?
Yes, he is.
Okay. Would he mind answering that question about the roundabout for us? Sorry, it's a little bit out of process, but I think it is an important point, and if he can assist us there, it would be very useful.
Sure. Here now. So was there a specific question, or would you just like me to talk to the roundabout? Firstly, there's a roundabout which has been put in. Its reasons were, I understand, and you can confirm or otherwise, that it was as a result of this presumably reasonably significant safety issues that there were with that intersection, and it's been based on the current problem as opposed to a future problem. It's not been, my understanding is, and can confirm it, it's not being designed to accommodate future growth. My understanding is the primary driver for the roundabout was safety. There were a number of crashes at the old crossroads, including a fatality over the years, which informed the business case for that, and also two other roundabouts which are in the detailed design stage on the Shands Road corridor. However, the roundabout is obviously built and designed to cater for future growth. And that's sort of covered in my analysis of modelling on future growth volumes, or future 2038 volumes that I've used in my assessment. Okay,
thank you. Perhaps we'll get back to, I've got one more question, Ms. Lansdene.
So just have to swap seats.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
All right, I'm back.
Okay, your evidence in chief. If I can just find the right section, where you talk about the pressure for potential industrial areas on the other side of Christchurch Southern Motorway to perhaps leap the motorway. Fuel Power 38.
38.
Of your evidence in chief, remaining land between the current edge of Prebbleton and the motorway has become leftover land with access limited from Prebbleton side, instead of allowing the industrial activities on the Christchurch side of the motorway to spill over. The offers the opportunity to provide a robust buffer. Now, when I originally read this, I had thought that, well, the motorway is a significant boundary in its own right in between industrial activities in Hornby, so there wouldn't be any necessary pressure for industrial on the Prebbleton side of the motorway, would there?
What I'm indicating here is that easy access to the motorway, which can be achieved from the Prebbleton side, opens up opportunities for industrial development to coexist adjacent to the motorway, because it would not have that much of a conflict with regard to reverse sensitivity, noise impact, and so on. And it has a direct access route to that motorway for transport purposes. So there is an affinity between motorways and industrial developments. So that is what I'm indicating here. And should there be a need within the Southern District for that to, for industrial land, then that would be a location that it would naturally gravitate to if it's needed within the area. So it's not necessarily saying that I say there has to be industrial development or there's demand for it, because that is not my expertise at all to identify that. What I'm saying is that there's an affinity for these locations to be developed with an industrial land use because of the lack of reverse sensitivity between the two activities, the motorway and the industrial area.
Yeah, I understand all that. You look anywhere around the world, and a new motorway with a new intersection does have some attractions to those activities which require good accessibility to the arterial network.
Yes, and if you then look at the boundary between Selborne and Christchurch, which straddles across the motorway, you can see that within the Christchurch city boundary, the industrial is pushing onto both sides of the motorway already. So, and there is nothing really, there's nothing significant to prevent that extending into the Selborne district, apart from a boundary between two, the Selborne area and the Christchurch area, which is a line on a piece of paper. And
so
obviously,
sorry, that industrial growth you're referring to, is that planned or is that reactive?
That is reactive. I'm not aware, and I would probably have to refer back to Fiona Aston with regards to whether anything along that area has been planned and whether it's exactly zoned like that. But that I would predict that will increase in that area around this access point onto the motorway.
Okay, but without any strategic planning that would justify that occurring.
Private plan changes could occur.
Ms. Aston may have a view on that.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Look, I don't have any further questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so the final witness is Ms. Aston.
Sorry, just get the ice. Good morning, Ms. Aston. I do have your summary statement, which was emailed to me before. So I'll just get that up. Thank you.
We're just waiting for Ms. Aston's mic to warm up.
Oh, okay.
I think that's working now.
It is, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Shall I read the summary? Is that what you wanted? Yes. I think the idea was that I read the summary, if that's all right with you.
Yes, it's fine, thank you.
Okay. Just starting at paragraph 2, the NPS, the urban development. Mr. Colgrove considers there is a clear need for the proposed development to help meet the district's NPS UD capacity requirements, particularly in terms of meeting the demand for additional large lot residential over time, as required by Policy 1, i.e. have or enable a variety of homes that meet the needs in terms of type, price and location of different households. My assessment of LLR capacity, which complements Mr. Colgrove's, is that there are no remaining existing or potential supply provided for by way of the Selwyn Rural Residential Strategy 2014 urban growth overlay areas, as these are already fully developed or sold or proposed or approved for full urban residential zoning. And secondly, the capacity enabled by private plan changes 59 and 67 is of limited relevance because the West Melton and Prebbleton housing markets cannot be readily substituted. And these areas are subject to submissions, which are supported by the Officer's report for general residential rezoning. They're in single ownership, so cannot be relied upon to support a competitive LLR housing and land market, as required by the NPS-UD, that is Objective 2. Going on to the NPS-HPL. In my opinion, the NPS-HPL does not apply to the site because it does not qualify as highly productive land under clause 3.57a. It contains LEC 2 and 3 soils, but is zoned rural inner plains in the operative Selwyn plan and proposed to be zoned general rural subject to the SCA RD1 overlay in the proposed plan, both of which have a minimum lot size of 4 hectares. And the nearest equivalent zone in the national planning standards is the rural lifestyle zone. I'm sure you're familiar with that. In any case, moving on to point 5, all clause 3.6 criteria for allowing urban development of highly productive land are met for the reasons outlined in my paragraphs 4 to 9 below. The requested LR falls within the definition of an urban rezoning. The LR rezoning is required to provide sufficient development capacity to meet demand for housing to give effect to the NPS-UD. There aren't any other reasonably practical and feasible options for providing at least sufficient development capacity within the same locality and market while achieving a well-functioning urban environment. Mr. Colgrove considers there's limited potential for greater intensification with the existing urban areas in Selwyn District, but more fundamentally, this would result in much smaller sections than the LLR sites, so it isn't an option. Rezoning of land that is not highly productive as urban is not feasible in the Prebbleton or generally in the Greater Christchurch context because historical settlement patterns mean that it is difficult to expand current urban areas without consuming class 1 to 3 soils. Land west of Rolleston, which is not HPL and cannot be readily substituted in any case as meeting Prebbleton's housing needs, is already zoned LLR and subject to private plan changes and submissions for NDR rezoning. There are no other rezoning options involving different highly productive land that has a relatively lower productive capacity. The site is highly fragmented into 14 undersized rural lifestyle lots. Mr. Colgrove and Mr. Ford have both assessed it as having very minimal and insignificant long-term productive potential, even if all sites were amalgamated into a single 41-hectare block, which is not a realistic option. The environmental, social, cultural and economic benefits of rezoning outweigh the long-term environmental, social, cultural and economic costs associated with the loss of highly productive land for land-based primary production. There will be significant benefits from enabling the proposed LR zone rezoning. It will contribute to the short, medium and long-term housing capacity shortfalls at Prebbleton, help meet the demand for LR living opportunities in a suitable location and which cannot be met elsewhere, add choice and diversity to the housing market, support housing affordability by facilitating more competition, and enable alternative forms of housing which are more suited to larger sites, including intergenerational living and provision for semi-independent family members such as teenagers, students, or obviously elderly parents, and minor dwellings. There are minimal, if any, economic costs associated with the loss of LEC 2 and 3 soils comprising the site because of its very limited land-based productive potential. And there are no significant social, environmental, cultural values associated with retaining a rural lifestyle equivalent zoning. Reverse sensitivity issues will not arise, given that adjoining rural land is also used for rural lifestyle purposes with some low-level grazing. Going on to the officer's reports, the proposed rezoning meets UG02, OG and UG P9, incorporating amendments as recommended by the officer's report in response to the NPS-HPL. The officer's strict policy threshold for rezoning based on the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement and the Rural Residential Framework is, in my opinion, out of date and inappropriate, does not take into account the NPS-UD or the MPS HPL and relies on the outdated Selwyn Rural Residential Growth Strategy 2014. Neither does it take account of the OR Urban Growth Right of Reply recommended amendment to UGP 13 to remove the requirement for urban growth areas to be within the urban growth overlay. The officer's report has not assessed the proposed zoning against the MPS UD, in particular responsive planning provisions objective 6C and policy 8. The rezoning is entirely consistent with the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement and PDP objectives and policies, except in as they relate to urban form in accordance with MAP A. That inflexible approach to urban form is inconsistent with the MPS, the higher order document. The proposal meets the rural residential framework and greenfield residential framework criteria, except where these are inconsistent or do not give effect to the MPS UD. The proposed rezoning density sits in between the proposed densities for medium density residential zone and the notified proposed district plan large lot residential zone. The latter is an average of 5,000 squares per site. It is the most appropriate density for this West Melton peri-urban edge location, as explained by Ms. Lawrenston, and will significantly widen housing choice at Prebbleton, particularly in light of the MR zoning under variation 1. The evidence for the submitter is that high densities will not undermine rural amenity, Ms. Lawrenston, or rural production, Mr. Ford. The proposed outline development plan and proposed district plan rules in combination will protect the efficient operation of the Islington Springston significant electricity distribution line, which crosses the site close to Shands Road. The evidence for the submitter, Ms. Lawrenston, is that the rezoning will not have any adverse urban form effects.
Thank you. We'll go to questions. Rowan?
No, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Neither do I. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Aston. As I said at the outset, we're getting a number of pieces of evidence and legal submissions on various points about the HPL. Or the MPS HPL, and we've had similar on MPS UD. You heard my discussions with Ms. Lionstein about whether it's a good thing to expand Prebbleton out towards the motorway. Do you have any comment on that discussion that I had with her, particularly in relation to the importance of strategic planning processes, possibility of precedent? If this occurs, what happens to the other land around the outside of this particular site? Is Shands Road a defensible boundary? Well, what would your comments be on that cluster of propositions?
Okay, first of all, you do have a requirement under the MPS UD to provide sufficient land to meet housing needs for the next 10 years. So with respect, in my view, you have to provide some large lot residential zoning to meet those requirements. So in a sense, the spatial planning exercise actually isn't really open to you. And I've done in my analysis, it was quite a detailed analysis about what other LLR zoning is available in the district, in the Greater Christchurch area. I mean, in my view, it really needs to be Prebbleton based to meet those particular needs, but I have gone far, looked at West Melton, and there's nothing really there. The other, so I in a sense, I don't mean strategic planning is a luxury in a sense that you don't have in this case. Secondly, also to give you some comfort, I think Ms. Lawrenson is making the point that even if there was a strategic planning exercise, you've got some very firm, experienced urban design evidence that certainly from an urban design perspective says that in looking at the long-term urban form of Prebbleton and logically how it might develop, I don't think you're going to compromise any long-term strategic planning exercise. You could say, well, I mean, and there may be some planners that say, oh, we don't really support large lot residential development as a form of development anymore because it's inefficient in terms of intensification objectives, but you've got to weigh that against the MPS UD, which requires you to meet housing needs for a variety of housing needs, and particularly with the focus on medium density. In my view, you simply cannot not make suitable provision for some LR rezoning, and this is, in my opinion, and drawing on the evidence in particular from Ms. Lawrence, and this is an ideal location for it.
Okay, and in terms of, you know, I understand all of what you're saying in relation to the MPSUD, but it all comes down to a critical, if you like, test that it's got to create a well-functioning urban environment. With Shands Road being what it is, and this being on the other side of the Shands Road from the remainder of Prebbleton, how do you as a planner what do you consider as a planner to be a well-functioning urban environment in the context of what we're talking about here?
I mean, I've analysed in my evidence the elements of a well-functioning urban environment as set out in Policy 1, and this site, in my opinion, easily meets them in terms of connectivity to Prebbleton. It's connected by multiple transport roads. There's an existing cycle way into the city along Shands Road, right alongside the road frontage here, which also connects into the centre of Prebbleton. It's got ready access to a major transport corridor. Those are all elements of a well-functioning urban environment. It fits the definition of large lot residential in the plan, which is to be on the peri-urban edge. And the Ms. Lawrence's evidence is that the Shands Road is the clear boundary to the, in her opinion, to full urban residential development, as has been approved by Plan Change 68. A very large area now of medium density residential out to Shands Road. So I'm absolutely confident that this site meets all of those criteria for a well-functioning urban environment. It can be well integrated with infrastructure. There's no issues there. I'm very comfortable with that.
And in terms of plan integrity, and treating similar circumstances in exactly the same way, a rezoning to large lot residential of these properties still maintains the plan integrity in relation to urban form?
I would say plan integrity is more an issue for resource consents rather than this is a 10-year planning review.
Why do you say it's about resource consents when you have some overall strategic directions, when you have urban growth policies and so forth, and you have a demarcation and maps of land, and obviously there's various plan changes have been going on and so forth as well, which are all part of the context. But how do you say that a submission on a district plan review which identifies rural land to be rezoned for large lot residential wouldn't contribute to plan integrity?
I guess the other point is that I'm very comfortable that the proposal is consistent with all the relevant objectives and policies, except those which are don't give effect to the MPSUD. So I plan integrity only arises anyway whether there is some conflict of contrariness to plan objectives and policies, which isn't the case here. And in terms of, I know you've expressed some concern about what will happen to the rest of the land between here, Shands Road and the motorway, and there are some other submissions for that land, but none of them have been supported with any substantive evidence. So I don't think you're in a position to be able to do an assessment of those on their merits. Equally, there's the Fisher assessment to the other side of the road, in Shands Road, which is for large lot, but again, no supporting evidence. And ideally, probably full residential would be better for that site. So I think so really, those other ones aren't on the table for you to consider because there's no evidence
No,
substantial
I-
evidence for their merits. Yes.
yes, no,
And if
I'm
the-
not, sorry, I'm not saying that is the case here, but I am particularly interested in if there was this large lot residential zoning, which is in a finger on the other side of Shands Road from the remainder of Prebbleton,
Mm.
never been identified before, what that would mean for potential plan changes which may come up, or resource consents which may come up, which want to do a similar sort of thing.
Well,
So
I think they would be, as has been the case with all the other private plan changes that have have been going through the system over the last 2 or 3 years. They all have to meet those criteria under the MPS, and urban development as being well-functioning urban environments. The council has to be aware of the responsive planning obligations. So I think that there's a pattern of other ones having been considered on their merits against the relevant statutory framework. And none of those decisions have raised issues of precedent because they're outside the RPS map A boundaries, etc. They've all been assessed on their merits against the evidence put in front of them and the relevant statutory framework. In this case, the council may say that once the planners' decisions are issued, they have a discretion to not accept private plan changes within 2 years of the plan being made operative, if the matter has already been fully considered through the proposed plan process. So there is a discretion, I guess. I would probably say the likes of the Fisher submission hasn't been able to be fully assessed because there wasn't the evidence, but that's an option that's open to the council to consider at that time.
Okay. No, look, I don't have anything additional here. It's obviously a reasonably complex situation in and around Prebbleton generally. It's relatively complex. But
There was just one point of information for you. Sorry, very much a detail point about the roading standards that you asked in an earlier question. Sorry, going to a matter of detail. If you look at table 7 of the transport provisions of the proposed plan, they set out the roading standards for the large lot residential zone, the widths and the requirements for cycleways or on pathways, etc. And it's also addressed in the narrative of the ODP.
okay, thank you. If you've completed everything, Ms. Everly?
Yes, thank you, sir. That's all.
Okay, suggest we adjourn for 15 minutes and come back probably around about 10 to 11, 10:50.
Thank you.
Thank you. Morning all again. We'll reconvene. Next submitter we have, I see Miss Ford is coming online now. Trices Road Rezoning Group.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for appearing by Zoom today. Understand you.
I'm not there in person.
Well, I apologise. I'm not there in person either, but mine's weather related, not COVID related. So
Yes, very disappointing.
and
Not me.
And I don't know, Ms. Ford, whether you've caught up with Commissioner Van Voorsthuysen's position. He's in Hawke's Bay. Very limited access to any modern technology, I understand. Now, my understanding is that he will be reviewing the proceedings of the Prebbleton rezoning hearings that we're going through at the moment. And if he has any additional questions, he'll put those in writing.
Sure.
Okay. So over to you. We've got your legal submissions and we've reviewed the relevant evidence here. So obviously highlight any key matters and we'll take things from there.
Thank you. I represent the Trices Road Rezoning Group, a group of landowners who have been working together for some time now to secure residential rezoning of their rural block of land at the southern edge of Prebbleton. The site's held in multiple ownership and lot sizes range between 2 and 8 hectares. In the room before you is Miss Eston, who has prepared 2 briefs of planning evidence in support of this submission. So please do feel free to direct questions to either of us. Also in the room are members of the Trices Road Rezoning Group, with others watching online. The outcome of this hearing is another step in what has turned into a lengthy, complicated and costly journey for this landowner group. I propose to touch on 5 key issues relating to the site. Briefly, given that I know that you've pre-read submissions, evidence, alternate forms of relief, jurisdiction, the MPS HPL and the Christchurch City Council evidence. Firstly, it is understood from earlier hearings that the panel intends to make decisions based on the evidence before it in this hearing. For this submitter, evidence has been filed by 9 witnesses. Briefs filed are identical to those filed in support of Plan Change 72, which covers the same site and was approved by Commissioner Thomas and adopted by the Council in April 2022. The Council's Section 42A report for Prebbleton has not assessed any of the evidence, rather it recommends that the submission is rejected and it's dealt with under the Variation 1 hearings. This approach is a hard pill to swallow for the Trices Road Rezoning Group, who have invested heavily in progressing rezoning of the site. There are no appeal rights under the variation process, and the landowner group requests a determination from the panel in this hearing that retains the urban residential zoning approved under Plan Change 72. Apart from Miss Aston, none of the 8 other witnesses who have prepared briefs are in attendance today. This is a resourcing decision which I hope will not be to the detriment of the landowner group. Many of the technical experts supporting the submission have already and are due to appear before you in relation to other rezoning requests. There are issues in common across many of the submitters, and the Trices Road Rezoning Group seeks to adopt the evidence presented in relation to those other hearings where relevant. As the substantive merits-based assessment for the site was completed by Commissioner Thomas when he determined Plan Change 72, I ask that you rely on that assessment and adopt it as support for advancing the submission under the proposed plan framework. A copy of that decision was included with the evidence filed. With respect to relief, this submission is an interesting one in that sought several alternate forms of relief, as did Plan Change 72. The preferred relief that's been pursued in this hearing is a general residential zoning. In the unlikely event that the IPI process declines that medium density residential standards ought to be applied in Prebbleton, then this submitter seeks in the alternative large lot residential zoning as a fallback option. This is to protect them against a scenario where, following significant investment, they end up with no change to the rural status quo of their land. With respect to jurisdiction, The council variations are split into two parts. Part A, which is the introduction of the NDRS to the proposed plan, and Part 2, the introduction of the NDRS to approved plan changes. Notwithstanding appeal under the operative plan, this site's captured by both. It's understood that the panel accepts it has jurisdiction to determine submissions seeking rezoning from rural to residential, notwithstanding that the submission does not include the MDRS provisions. The council exercised discretion to include the site as a new residential zone in Part A. It submitted this decision confirms council's view of the suitability of the site for intensification. In my submission, there's nothing to prevent this panel making a decision to accept the rezoning request in this submission. In fact, based on the evidence before it, I consider it incumbent to do so. It can then be left to the panel determining the variations to confirm the appropriate intensification of the site. The National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land does not apply to the site. It meets both relevant exemptions. A, it's identified for future urban development, and B, it's included in Variation 1, which is a council-initiated notified plan change. As well, Plan Change 72 was a notified plan change that has since been adopted by the council. Of note, the council has accepted the same assessment in relation to Plan Change 69 in the Lincoln rezoning hearings. Plan Change 69 and 72 are at the same stage. They're both approved and adopted by the council. They're both under appeal to the Environment Court for different matters, and both included in Variation 1, Part A and B. In relation to the Plan Change 69 site, the Section 42A report for Lincoln states, it's agreed that the NPS HPL does not apply to the rezoning request as the land is subject to a plan change to rezone it and it is identified for future urban development. I submit that the same approach ought to apply here. At paragraph 31 of my written submissions, I have stated that the rural residential strategy is a future development strategy. This is a typo, and I'd be grateful if you'd make a correction so that it ought to correctly read a strategic planning document. Lastly, I turn to Mr. Lightbody's evidence. The only further submitted evidence filed in relation to Prebbleton rezoning hearings was from Mr. Lightbody for the Christchurch City Council. He appeared before you on Tuesday and you did not have any questions of him. Mr. Lightbody's evidence relies on housing capacity assessments that are outdated, and in my submission is surpassed by the evidence of Mr. Colgrave, Mr. Sellers and Mr. Jones in relation to this site. In his decision, the Commissioner states, the evidence of Messrs. Colgrave, Sellers and Jones is very evident that there is demand at Prebbleton that is not being met, and that this cannot be expected to be met by increased supply at Rolleston. He goes on to say, with reference to Policy 2 of the NPS Urban Development, that this policy refers to at all times, and therefore it is not acceptable to argue that this matter should await the development of a spatial plan and then full review of the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement. An assessment against the OBS and POLs in the National Policy Statement for Urban Development and the Commissioner's decision on Plan Change 72 was comprehensive. He found that Plan Change 72 would contribute to a well-functioning urban environment and gives effect to the NPSUD. At paragraph 38 of my written submissions, I state that Christchurch City Council has not filed a submission opposing the inclusion of Plan Change 72 in Variation 1. This is correct. For context, particularly as Christchurch City and Canterbury Regional Council prepared a joint case at the Plan Change 72 hearing, it is relevant that the Regional Council, in its submission on the variation, now directly supports the rezoning of Plan Change 72, together with other listed plan changes, as I quote, it enables the consolidation and intensification of urban areas sought in Canterbury Regional Policy Statement Objective 6.2.2. This objective deals with urban form and settlement patterns. I agree with the planning timetable presented by Mr. Cleary at the Rolleston hearings that challenges Mr. Lightbody's assertions that, again, I quote, additional supply is not required right now and that there is sufficient time to consider additional areas for growth through the spatial planning framework over the next 30 years. The timetable prepared by Mr. Cleary and supported by a number of other council illustrates that even if the future spatial planning process does enable more residential land, it will be at least 10 years before that land can realistically hit the market. The updated evidence of Mr. Colgrave, which assesses new data released at the end of 2022, also presented in relation to the Rolleston hearings, identifies Selwyn's residential development capacity will be exhausted over the life of this plan. In my submission, urgent action is required now to ensure that the council can fulfil the clear directives of the NPSUD. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Raywin?
No, I don't have any questions because, well, it took me a while to kind of understand the situation, but I finally got there and I have no questions. Your submission was clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nicole?
I don't have questions either. I back up with what Raywin said. It's quite clear whatever you have stated in your evidence. Thank you.
Yeah, I've just got a couple of points, not really questions, but the first one is that Commissioner Solomon, Commissioner Van Voorsthausen and myself will be considering the Prebbleton component of the variation 1. So there is continuity between this process and the ISPP process to come up later in the year. So that's the first thing. And you mentioned that we didn't have any questions of Mr. Lightbody. We held hearings 2 weeks ago on Rolleston.
I understand there was some questions, yeah.
And it was primarily the same evidence that was presented for the Rolleston rezoning hearings as what was presented here. So I take on board what you say. Obviously, the site has got significant planning history and a lot of that very recent. So obviously the Commissioner's recommendation adopted by Council on Plan Change 72 is very much in play in terms of our consideration. But I don't have any legal questions that have been traversed, if not by you, by others. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. What I will do now then, panel and commissioners, is hand over to Miss Aston, who is in the room.
Hello again, Miss Aston.
Hello. I'm not intended to read my rebuttal, so I'm just happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Raywin?
I don't think so. I have to just check back over my notes. Sorry, Lindsay.
That's all right. If there is anything, let me know and we can accommodate that. Nicole?
I didn't have any questions that I could remember. I'm just having a flick through as well, like Raywin.
Ms. Aston, I don't have any questions either. The evidence that's just been presented is comprehensive on this particular matter. And as I mentioned to Council before, a number of the issues that you've raised, MPSUD, MPSHPL, have been traversed, if not by yourselves, by others as well. So we're very familiar with the planning arguments and the planning context for the site, and we're also very familiar with your relief and what the options are available to us in terms of making a decision here. So look, I don't have any questions either, but thank you both for your time. An awful lot of effort has gone into this process with Plan Change 72, the Environment Court, etc. as well. And we did hear from Council and a planner for Mr. Drinnan as well. So there's that additional level of complexity which will need to be factored in as well. But thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we'll adjourn now. And that is the completion of the hearings on the Rolleston rezonings. Yes, so thank you. I'm just wondering whether the fellow commissioners can remain behind after others leave, and we can have a discussion about where to go next. Thank you.